In late August 1982, right before the start of 6th grade, here were three things I knew for sure. One, that Eye of the Tiger was the greatest song I'd ever heard. Two, that girls were gross, and that some of them apparently had cooties, the details of which I didn't know much about, but I knew enough to stay away. And three, that I could not walk into school that first day without a pair of Nikes on my feet. Now, up until that point, as a little kid, I didn't care at all about fashion. Before school every year, my parents dragged me to some store like Jefferson Ward or James Way and bought me a few shirts, a few pairs of pants, and a new pair of Trax sneakers, T-R-A-X. Unofficially, Trax were known as Bobos. You may remember Bobos. They make your feet feel fine. They cost $1.99. But that didn't matter because nobody cared. When you're an 8 or 9 or 10-year-old boy, the last thing you're thinking about is your clothes. But the summer before 6th grade, when we were all 11, I started to hear things. I started hearing about Nike sneakers, about how cool they were, about how all my friends were getting them. And although no one ever said it specifically, I knew it was going to be socially disastrous for me to show up after Labor Day wearing Bobos. So what changed? Why did my friends start talking that summer? And why were they talking about this particular brand, Nike? Fast forward to 1991. I'm walking down South Street in Philadelphia, which is sort of the Greenwich Village of Philly. Punk rock, fringe art, bohemian vibes galore. And I see this guy walking my way, about to cross my path. He's wearing a sleeveless tee, and imprinted on his upper left arm, I see the unmistakable shape of the Nike swoosh. Now, it's important to set historical context here. For a teenager or young adult in 1991, there was no bigger crime you could commit worse than selling out. We had this idea in the 90s that trading any part of yourself in exchange for money was the worst thing a human being could do. Theft, arson, murder, these were all understandable crimes if the circumstances were right. I mean, we're only human beings after all. But selling out was unforgivable. And beyond that, there was a general sense that being successful in any way was a kind of selling out. Because to be successful meant you had to work hard, and if you were working hard, you were working for someone else, and trading your valuable time to help someone else make money was just like the lamest thing ever, man. Now, I'm not arguing that this made a ton of sense. Again, I'm just setting the context for this particular afternoon in 1991. So when I see the Nike swoosh on this guy's arm, my jaw just about hits the concrete. I mean, this guy literally branded himself with a brand. He was a walking billboard for some sneaker company. I mean, why not just tattoo the Marlboro logo on your other arm or the McDonald's golden arches on your forehead? I couldn't help myself. I stopped the guy in his tracks. "Yeah?" he said. "Dude," I said, "what are you doing with a Nike logo tattooed on your arm?" An ear-to-ear smile came over the guy's face. He said, "Just do it, dude," and kept on strutting down the street. Now, I gotta be honest, it actually struck me as an interesting take, even in the moment, because he was right. The Nike swoosh was inextricably linked to the words, "just do it." Even if those words weren't explicitly on his arm, those words were represented by that symbol. And those words, "just do it," that spirit, I had to admit, it's a pretty good philosophy to live by. To hold the concept that you have agency in this world, that you're never stuck in an existential state you don't want to be in, that neither your own self-doubt nor your biggest competition can stop you from achieving your dreams in life. If the guy would have tattooed some quote from Socrates or Emerson or Maya Angelou, some words of wisdom that held a gravitas that made you think and could serve as some guiding light for one's own existence, I would have applauded him. But in a way, that was exactly what this guy had on his arm, except, of course, for the cardinal sin that it was mediated through a for-profit brand. Anyway, for several seconds after that guy trotted off, I stood on that part of South Street, frozen, and wondered about that, about whether he was indeed a sellout, or was he a guy, unlike me at 20 years old, who had found his existential North Star. Hello, one and all. My name is Greg Ippolito. Welcome to the second episode of our limited series, The Greatest Ad Campaigns of All Time, where we are featuring, in no particular order, the greatest ad campaigns of all time, though that should be evident from the title. And today, we're talking about Nike's legendary Just Do It campaign. Okay, so the development of this campaign was weird. Usually, an ad agency is told to go create something, they create it, the campaign launches, and yada yada, it all happens in a short space of time. But the Just Do It campaign, upon close examination, really happened over 3 watershed moments across 13 years. So let's do a little historical overview. I know, the history of the Nike company has been written about like 1,000 times. But for the uninitiated, let's do a lightning round recap. 1964. Phil Knight and Bill Bowerman found Blue Ribbon Sports. Knight was on the track team at the University of Oregon. Bowerman was his coach. After earning his MBA at Stanford, Knight had this idea about producing running shoes in Japan versus Germany, which at the time was the primary exporter, because labor was cheaper in the East. Knight flies to Japan to meet with the Onitsuka Tiger Shoe Company and signs a deal with them to export a line of Tiger sneakers to the U.S. Now, Coach Bowerman believed the German running shoes were better, but nothing that couldn't be improved upon. So he and Knight struck a 50-50 ownership deal, and their company is off and running. Pun intended. 1971. Phil Knight takes a fateful trip to Greece, where he visits the Temple of Athena Nike, dedicated to Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and Nike, the goddess of victory. Knight was a dedicated runner and believed in athletics. In his autobiography, Shoe Dog, Knight wrote, quote, "I believed in running. I believed that if people got out and ran a few miles every day, the world would be a better place," end quote. This was the first watershed moment. Knight didn't see sneakers as a mere tool, a thing to help you get a job done, because in his mind, running, athletics, aren't just a job to be done. They're about something bigger, something existential, spiritual, transcendent. And the sneakers you chose to engage in that bigger thing can carry the essence of that thing. So in that first watershed moment, seeing the carving in the parapet that showed the goddess Nike fixing her sandal, Knight realized that the company he co-founded could be about more than providing great sneakers for running. It could be about giving people a conduit to a better life. Knight came back to the States and told Bowerman they were renaming the company to Nike. Oh, one more important thing that happened in 1971. They hired a Portland State University art student named Carolyn Davidson to create a logo for this new Nike brand. That logo was the iconic swoosh, one of the most globally recognized logos in the last 50 years. The fee for her design? $35. 1972. Nike cuts ties with the Onitsuka Tiger Company. In contract negotiations, Tiger was trying to strong-arm them into forking over 51% of their equity. Basically, make us majority owners or we'll stop supplying you with your main product. Knight and Bowerman essentially said, fuck that, and started putting the infrastructure in place to move on without them. Around this time, they also signed the Romanian tennis star Ilie Nastase to an endorsement deal, the company's first. By the way, Onitsuka Tiger eventually renamed itself as a brand you may know today called ASICS. Not exactly Nike, but a modest success nonetheless. 1974. The Waffle Trainer. Coach Bowerman and his wife were having breakfast one morning when an idea came to him. He grabbed the waffle iron and started pressing rubber into it to create a new sole for track shoes. The idea was to create something that would grip but be lightweight to increase the runner's speed. First introduced as the moon shoe in 1972, because the tread kind of sort of resembled the footprints left by astronauts on the moon, the technology was refined and re-released in 1974 as simply the waffle trainer, and it was a huge hit. In fact, the waffle trainer went on to become the best-selling running shoe in the United States. Nike was officially on its way. Side note, in honor of Bowerman's out-of-the-box spirit of innovation, the R&D laboratory at Nike today is known as the Innovation Kitchen. All right, the history lightning round is over. Let's jump ahead to 1977. The company is growing like crazy. Advisors are telling Bowerman and Knight that going public is not just a good idea, it's inevitable. But all of this fast growth is giving them a sense of dis-ease and also a sense of lost identity. Here's Phil Knight again from Shoe Dog. Quote, "Many afternoons I'd sit around the office trying to figure out what people thought of us and why. We didn't have focus groups or market research. We couldn't afford them. So we tried to intuit, divine, read tea leaves. Clearly, people liked the look of our shoes, we agreed. Clearly, they liked our story, Oregon firm founded by running geeks. Clearly, they liked what wearing a pair of Nikes said about them. We were more than a brand. We were a statement. Some of the credit went to Hollywood. We had a guy out there giving Nikes to stars, all kinds of stars, big, little, rising, fading. Every time I turned on the TV, our shoes were on a character in some hit show. Starsky and Hutch, The $6 Million Man, The Incredible Hulk. Somehow, our Hollywood liaison got a pair of Senorita Cortezes into the hands of Farrah Fawcett, who wore them in a 1977 episode of Charlie's Angels. That was all it took. One quick shot of Farrah and Nikes, and every shoe store in the nation was sold out of Senorita Cortezes by noon the next day. Soon, the cheerleaders at UCLA and USC were jumping and leaping in what was commonly known as the Farrah shoe." End quote. So the popularity thing was theirs, but nailing down their identity remained elusive. The bigger they got, the more nebulous it became. So Knight brought in John Brown and Partners, an advertising agency based in Seattle. This was watershed moment number 2. Knight was skeptical of advertising, but he wanted to see what they could do. The agency created a print ad called "There Is No Finish Line." This was the first foundational step in the creation of the Nike brand as we know it today. Here's Phil Knight again from Shoe Dog. Quote, "The ad showed a single runner on a lonely country road surrounded by tall Douglas firs. Oregon, clearly. The copy read, quote, 'Beating the competition is relatively easy. Beating yourself is a never-ending commitment,' end quote. Everyone around me thought the ad was bold, fresh. It didn't focus on the product, but on the spirit behind the product, which was something you never saw in the 1970s. People congratulated me on that ad as if we'd achieved something earth-shattering. I'd shrug. I wasn't being modest. I still didn't believe in the power of advertising. At all. A product, I thought, speaks for itself, or it doesn't. In the end, it's only quality that counts. I couldn't imagine that any ad campaign would ever prove me wrong or change my mind. Our advertising people, of course, told me I was wrong, 1,000% wrong. But again and again, I'd ask them, can you say definitively that people are buying Nikes because of your ad? Can you show it to me in black and white numbers? Silence. No, they'd say, we can't say that definitively. So then it's a little hard to get enthused, I'd say, isn't it? Silence. End quote. All right, for those of you out there who work in advertising, let me just say, don't you just hate this kind of client? I mean, next to maybe prostitution, advertising is the oldest profession. People have been doing it in some form or other for hundreds of years. Why? Because when you put up a flyer in the town square or run a print ad or put a spot on the radio, or put up a billboard, or whatever, sales go up. Until very recently, like the last 10, 15 years, the era of big data, the demand for direct attribution wasn't a thing. The strong correlation between an active campaign and increased sales was enough to justify media spend. But not for Phil Knight. If his agency couldn't explicitly show him the return on investment for each ad, he didn't want to hear it. Basically the worst client ever. Ironically, Phil Knight would become the client that greenlit not only one of the greatest ad campaigns of all time, but one of the first that promoted a brand concept that would be leveraged later for sales. So the opposite of direct attribution. Okay, moving on. Despite Knight's skepticism, John Brown and Partners kept churning out groundbreaking ads throughout the late 70s. One featured San Antonio Spurs star George Gervin, known as the Iceman, doing one of his patented finger rolls into the rim. The headline? The Iceman Cometh. Another ad featured 22 of the most famous players in the NBA dressed in black robes. The headline? The Supreme Court. But unimpressed, I guess, there isn't much history written about this. Phil Knight fired Brown and Partners in 1979. In their place, Knight promoted Peter Moore, an in-house artist who primarily designed shoes for Nike. Moore remained in charge of Nike's advertising for another couple of years until 1982 when he called his friend Dan Wieden, who was then a copywriter at the William Kane agency, to help him create some new ads for the company. Now, for those of you who know who Dan Wieden is, you know this is where the Nike story takes off. For those who don't, you're about to find out. But before we get into it, I want to remind you, dear listener, of the Phil Knight quote I rattled off just a few minutes ago. The one about his feelings on that breakthrough Nike ad from Brown and Partners. Quote, "I still didn't believe in the power of advertising. At all. A product, I thought, speaks for itself, or it doesn't. In the end, it's only quality that counts. I couldn't imagine that any ad campaign would ever prove me wrong or change my mind." End quote. I couldn't imagine that any ad campaign would ever prove me wrong or change my mind. Okay, now allow me to quote Phil Knight from an interview about 10 years ago when Dan Wieden was inducted into the Advertising Hall of Fame. Quote, "While I did introduce myself to Dan Wieden and say I don't really like advertising, what I was really saying was that I don't like traditional advertising. And so Dan Wieden and his creativity and his intensity made me a big fan of advertising." End quote. Knight explained that when advertising creates media buzz, that's a game changer. Quote, "When we get it right, they go together." That is, the advertising and the media buzz. "It's not easy to do, but getting those two things to go together behind a great product is what makes a successful campaign." End quote. So we've got some conflicting testimony from Mr. Knight about his feelings toward advertising, but history does tell us that at some point, Wieden made Knight a believer. So again, it's 1982. Nike had created buzz through media stunts like the Farrah Fawcett thing. And between their external and in-house creative teams, they've been churning out some really eye-catching ads for years. Now, like I said at the top, there was enough going on with the Nike brand that in 1982, walking into day one of sixth grade without a pair of Nikes on was social death. But the two things Nike had going for it, the buzz creation and the ad campaigns, were happening independently. They hadn't aligned yet. Plus, Nike's brand identity still hadn't come into full form. It was all the rumblings before the earthquake was about to hit. Dan Wieden and his partner, David Kennedy, both creatives at Kane in Portland, earned Knight's respect with some really wild thinking around the Nike brand. With the signing of a big contract, they both quit their jobs at Kane and started their own firm, Wieden and Kennedy. They spent the next 5 years stretching the limitations of what advertising would allow and what advertising could achieve. Here's Dan Wieden.
We were pretty stupid when we began, and our client didn't know what to do with us either. And so between Nike and Wieden and Kennedy, we kind of just ignored the rules of advertising such as we had heard them, because that sounds stupid. And we just explored and tried to do unusual things and do the unexpected. That was the thing we both had in common, was a lack of tradition and just a willingness to fuck something up, you know? So we just did a bunch of experiments and tried things out, and that led to a real sense of us against the world, you know? I mean, yeah, Nike was in Portland, Oregon, and we were in Portland, Oregon, and damn it, we were going to shake the world.
In 1984, Nike signed Michael Jordan, then a rookie with NBA Chicago Bulls and captain of the U.S. Olympic basketball team, to a 5-year contract for a reported $2.5 million. You'll remember that athlete celebrity endorsements were common for Nike, starting back with their endorsement of that very hard-to-pronounce tennis star in 1972. But Michael Jordan, as we know, was about to become not just the greatest basketball player of all time, but a media superstar. Peter Moore and his team designed a new sneaker, the Air Jordan, which was about to become an absolute shoe phenomenon. So really, at this point, Phil Knight was right. It was all about a great product and buzz generated by a dominant and charismatic celebrity spokesperson. Who needed advertising? But the Wieden-Kennedy campaign turned out to be game-changing. I'll prove it. Picture the Air Jordan logo in your mind. Took you about a half second to conjure that, right? Right. So the launch spot for the Air Jordan campaign, featuring MJ taking off on a playground court in slow motion while the sound of a jet engine roared in the background, was later named by Entertainment Weekly as one of the 50 greatest commercials of all time. But Wieden-Kennedy kept pushing the boundaries. A couple years later, Nike became the first company to license music by the Beatles for their groundbreaking Revolution spot. But it was a year after that watershed moment number 3 happened. Wieden-Kennedy had 5 separate creative teams create 5 distinct commercials for an upcoming Nike campaign. Before showing them to Phil Knight, Wieden needed a way to pull them all together into some singular, cohesive idea. Here's Dan Wieden.
The night before we made a presentation to Nike to show what we'd come up with, I was a little worried because the teams were so different and the approaches were so different that I thought we needed some tagline or something that would hold it together. And so I sat down and I wrote about 3 or 4 things, and then I actually, for some reason, there was a young man that had come from Portland, and he was a big troublemaker, and he went to Utah and killed a couple in a gas station. And he was put in jail and then taken before a firing squad. And before they put the hood over his head, he said, "Do you have any last words?" And he says, "Let's do it." And I thought, and for why that came to mind, I have no idea. But it was one of those things where you went, how in the hell, faced with that, would you say, "Bring it on, I'm up for it, bring it on"? And I just changed it a little bit and said, "Just do it." So in the morning I showed the team and they went, "We don't need a tagline." I said, "Well, I think we do. I'm just going to try it." They said, "Really you want to do that?" So we went in, same thing at Nike. "Oh, I like the spots, but a tagline, you really think we need?" I said, I don't know, I think we need something to hold together.
So, a few things here. First, this needs to be said out loud. Murderer Gary Gilmore was the inspiration for Just Do It. That's amazing. And if you wanted to write a sociology dissertation on how Western culture celebrates maniacal single-mindedness, from Gary Gilmore to Michael Jordan to Donald Trump and beyond, you would have a ton of evidence to make the case. But let's trace back to our 3 watershed moments. Watershed moment number 1, when Phil Knight saw the Temple of Athena Nike, and something touched him about Nike being the goddess of victory, and his belief that running could be the means to a better way of life. Watershed moment number 2, when Phil Knight opened his skeptical heart to advertising with John Brown and Partners. And watershed moment number 3, when Wieden and Kennedy took that fundamental belief about the greater implication of sports, about the spirit of victory, and expanded on what that could mean to different people. How, for a high school star athlete, it could mean making the state finals. But for an elderly person, it could mean getting off the couch and getting active again, or anything in between. Wieden Kennedy created 5 different ads, each one exploring a different definition of accomplishment through sport, and then unified them with 3 simple words. And the result was beyond anything he could have dreamed. Again, here's Dan Wieden, along with Liz Dolan, the former marketing chief at Nike.
None of us really paid that much attention. We thought, yeah, that'd work. And I think what happened, and it was sort of like a lot of things in life, is sometimes it's the most inadvertent things that you don't really see that are, people started reading things into it much more than sport.
I think they were amazed and delighted, but they would admit totally shocked at just the impact it had.
I think it's a good thing to live by.
Well, just do it.
Let's make it seem like anyone can do this, you know.
It kind of kicked me in the pants to, get, rejuvenated with my career.
Just do it. Do what you want.
I was a senior in high school, and it actually gave me courage to ask this girl out to the prom that I wanted to ask, and it worked.
People were applying it to just everything they had been putting off or procrastinating about or avoiding dealing with. I had women writing to us saying, I finally left the bum. They were like getting divorces based on the Just Do It slogan.
I started getting letters from people that had been having emotional problems or all sorts of issues where somehow this line and this way of looking at the world meant something much deeper than what we were even talking about,
To say the rest was history would be an understatement. To list and analyze the different ads and spots and sub-campaigns that have run over the last 36 years and influenced the culture is well beyond what we can handle on this limited podcast. But, like the little experiment we did with the Air Jordan logo, the proof is inside your head. Close your eyes. When I say just do it, which ad spot comes to mind? Is it Mars Blackman? Is it Bo Knows? Is it I Am Not a Role Model? Is it Tiger Woods juggling a golf ball on his club? Is it the little girls begging us to let them play sports? Is it the Colin Kaepernick ad? At the top of this podcast, I told you a story of that guy I ran into back in 1991 who had the Nike swoosh branded on his arm. How ridiculous I thought it was. But in a way, we've all had the Nike brand emblazoned on our brains and in our hearts for years. Just Do It is about as ubiquitous and influential as an ad campaign can get, and its emotional resonance is without equal. To wit, Advertising Age ranked Just Do It as number 4 on its list of the best advertising campaigns of the 20th century. Nike, the company, is currently ranked 88 on the Fortune 500 list, with a market cap of $197.8 billion. For a guy who didn't believe in advertising, Phil Knight's company holds a 38.6% total market share. Jesus. For reference, Amazon holds a 37.6% market share among e-commerce companies. That's how big, that's how dominant Nike is in its vertical. How do you arrive at that rare level of success? To summarize and paraphrase Phil Knight over the years, superior products, the ability to generate buzz, and an ad campaign that can facilitate that buzz. I want to close on another quote from Dan Wieden. This is him talking about advertising in general, not specific to Nike. Quote, "The best thing that can happen is when a creative team comes to make a presentation and you see something and it's like, whoa, where did that come from? I mean, it's so out of order. We do creative briefs and everything, so people are given an understanding of stuff. But then the creative people sometimes will have a certain twist or something maybe very subtle that's just new. It's gotta be new. Clients tend to look for something they've seen before, something they recognize, but what you're really looking for is something you've never seen before. End quote. As we heard earlier, Wieden and Kennedy started breaking all the rules since, as they said, they didn't know any better. And it was that original thinking, along with a singular brand positioning, that made a mere sneaker company into something bigger, an idea that generated a buzz that swept the country. Suddenly, these two little companies from Portland, Oregon, were influencing sneaker sales and culture in every major DMA in America. And that influence would continue literally for decades. So, a question to all the marketing leaders out there. Just how much logic should you apply to messaging decisions? Consider this. A big part of our jobs as marketers and advertisers is to move people to action. And people aren't very logical. Nike had the best running shoe in the country, the Waffle Trainer, during a time when jogging became a huge craze. It's estimated that around 25 million Americans took up jogging in the 1970s and 80s. Growing demand meets a superior product equals success. A plus B equals C. Logical. But here's the thing. The summer before 6th grade, I didn't want a pair of Nikes because they were the best running shoe. I never jogged in my life. I'm not sure I knew what jogging was. Or is it pronounced yogging? I don't know. Doesn't matter. Because me and the hundreds of kids in my school and the millions of kids across the country all wanted Nikes. But if Nike had decided to focus only on the logical equation, the A plus B equals C, they would have missed the much bigger opportunity, the one that was about to make Nike a multi-billion-dollar company. Here's a hot take. Big data as a movement is like an enormous iceberg that crashed into and destroyed something very important that was happening in marketing. That important thing was psychographics. In the mid to late 2000s, psychographics, research that attempted to unearth the psychology behind consumer behavior, was having a real moment. But then came big data. Over the last 15 plus years, we marketers have gained access to more and better data on audience behavior. And it's been fantastic, transcendent. But that's behavior. That's what an audience did. All these years later, we still haven't got much closer to the why. And the why, the emotional part, the feelings that precede the behavior, the Pavlovian stuff that pushes past logic and comes screaming out of people's souls. That is the difference between modest success and Nike-level success. Marketers talk automatically about the blending of art and science, but the truth is, for the most part, the science has supplanted the art. And without the art, without the risk, your ceiling can certainly rise, but never so high that it pushes past the clouds and out of your sight. And that is one thing I know for sure. One last note before we close. Remember Carolyn Davidson, the graphic designer who created the swoosh logo for $35? Well, in 1983, nearly 3 years after Nike went public, Phil Knight invited Davidson to a company reception. He presented her with a diamond ring engraved with a swoosh and an envelope containing 500 shares of Nike stock. That holding, after stock splits bring the total to about 32,000 shares, is worth around $2.5 million today. Not bad for a logo.